Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us to our monthly City Hall check-in. I'm Rodney Fong, President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. We're going to let this room fill up a little bit and get started just in a few minutes. Okay, the room is filling up and we'll go ahead and start. Obviously, this is live, but we will also record this for future viewing on YouTube on the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce's YouTube site. Want to thank our series sponsors, Safeway, BlackRock, Kaiser, and Delta Dental for being our sponsors, and our title sponsor, Waymo. And if you really haven't had a chance to take a look at what Waymo does, it is really the direction of the future. So I'm going to go ahead and roll this really quick video, and it'll explain what Waymo actually works on.
Say hello to Waymo, the world's most experienced driver. The Waymo driver is what we call our self-driving technology. It has over a decade of real-world experience and has driven millions of miles. With Waymo One, we can make it safer and easier for you to get around, so you can spend more time doing what you love. And with Waymo Via, the same driver with the same deep experience can also deliver your packages or save you a trip to the dry cleaners. Or if you run a business, Waymo Via can help you transport whatever you need, making sure shipments arrive right when they're supposed to. This is the Waymo driver, a driver that's reimagining transportation for all of us.
Thank you, Waymo. And for those of you that might be interested in doing a test drive with Waymo, a couple of us had an opportunity to actually get in a car. Absolutely fun, safe, a wild experience just to watch and how these computers take thousands of pictures a second and able to navigate things very safely. So thank you, Waymo. Today, we are honored to have Supervisor Mandelman with us. Supervisor Mandelman represents District 8 on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He currently serves on the Rules Committee and Government Audit and Oversight Committee. And prior to his election as supervisor, he had served as a deputy city attorney for the city of Oakland and was elected trustee of the City College San Francisco Board of Trustees. As well as deputy city attorney, Supervisor Mandelman practiced primary areas in real estate, economic development, and affordable housing. Gee, all things we happen to need as we recover in San Francisco. Since joining the Board of Supervisors in July 2018, Supervisor Mandelman has worked on and addressed the city's mental health issues, substance use crisis, and served as co-chair for the 2019 Methamphetamine Task Force, a huge undertaking and so much work to be done there. And thank you to the supervisor. In addition to that, supervisor has helped with secure funding for street crisis response teams, and he's led several initiatives to improve the city's public transportation system and co-chairing the Muni Reliability Working Group. All great things, Supervisor. Thank you. All just core infrastructure pieces to our great city. And I know that today you want to talk about a lot of different things on your agenda, but also the Safe Sleeping Sites program, which was started here, but we need to talk about how we're going to move into the future with this. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm sure we'll have some questions and maybe some comments that you can use the chat, and we'll have a little moderated question and answer after the supervisor speaks. So please, Supervisor, thank you very much for joining us today, and take it away.
Thanks, Rodney. And thanks everybody for tuning in, spending a little bit of your Monday afternoon talking policy and talking about homelessness. And I will briefly go over this legislation that I proposed called A Place for All. And it includes and refers to safe sleeping sites, but I don't actually think that, although I think safe sleeping sites would be part of implementation, in some ways that's not actually what the legislation is about. So A Place for All does three things. First, it establishes as the policy of the city and county of San Francisco that we will have a place, a safe, decent, humane place that is not the street, a sidewalk, a plaza, a park, for any unhoused person in San Francisco who's willing to take that placement. That is plainly not the reality in San Francisco right now, but I think it is what San Franciscans want. We're a compassionate city. We don't want to be cruel to people who are struggling, but oops, sorry about that. We don't want to be cruel to people who are struggling, and want to provide exits from the street. But we also, I think, believe that our public spaces are for everyone's use. And I think people are increasingly frustrated that so many public spaces are not available for everyone's use because they're being used as campsites. So that's the policy. And it's that exit from the street could be, there are many different options. San Francisco's done an amazing job of moving people into permanent supportive housing. We have a housing first policy as a city, which is to try and get people wherever possible directly from the street into housing and then wrap services around them. But of course, that's not always possible. And then so we have shelters and navigation centers to try and make up for some of that gap. And during the pandemic, we have begun exploring other faster, cheaper alternatives that we can set up more quickly, that are not as good by far, that are not housing, but are better than an encampment on the sidewalk. And so that has been the safe sleeping sites, which I've been a strong proponent of, at least getting the city to explore them. The city has opened 8 of these sites during the pandemic period to get folks off of the streets. And we've learned a lot from that experience. In some cases, what we tried did not work. If we don't put enough resources into these sites, if we don't have 24/7 staffing, if we don't have garbage pickup, a couple of sites have been real problems and had to be closed. But in other sites where we have had adequate staffing, where we provided showers and bathrooms 3 meals a day, and brought in service providers to assess people and help people problem solve and figure out their next step, that they have been certainly beneficial to the folks who've gone onto those lots, and they've been a tremendous benefit to the neighborhoods that have seen a reduction in the amount of camping that was going on in the middle of the pandemic year. So that was the first of the 3 things that the Place for All legislation will do. It'll establish this policy that San Francisco has never had of trying to have an exit from the street for anyone who will accept that. The second piece is to put in place a planning period where the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing and the Department of Real Estate are directed to try and figure out how to make that policy real. The legislation gives them, as introduced, gave them 60 days. It's become increasingly clear that they'll need more time than that. But we need to know what sites might be available, either currently under the city's control, or sites that could be used by the city if not currently under the city's control. How much would this cost? What are the different models? There's different ways to do certainly shelter, of course, but also safe sleeping sites. And we established in the legislation a minimum standard, again, of 24/7 staffing, access to bathrooms, access to showers. But there's plenty of room for experimentation with tiny homes or tough sheds or pods. Other cities have tried different versions of quick, fast, and cost-effective shelter that is better than a tent, and we can do that in San Francisco. The main point for me, again, is to have a place to offer any person who's willing to accept it, willing and able to accept it. So that planning period goes into effect, and what should come to the Board of Supervisors and the mayor at the end of that planning period is a report, an implementation plan that would have a cost and sites. And at that point, the Board of Supervisors would have to make the decision about whether to move forward, which would mean an appropriation. And I imagine, I don't imagine that, thousands and thousands of people would accept an offer of a placement in a safe sleeping site, but I imagine that there will be demand and that this is not going to be an inexpensive proposal. I'm guessing that if, we're doing 1,000 to 1,500 more placements, that could be tens of millions of dollars, which is a lot of money. But it is certainly just a fraction of what we spend overall on homelessness each year, in permanent supportive housing, cleanup costs for the street, all the other ways that we spend money on homelessness in San Francisco. We actually spend, I think, not enough offering people exits from the street. So that's the planning period. If the Board of Supervisors goes ahead and approves that implementation plan and appropriates the funds for it, then the legislation calls for establishment of enough shelter whether safe sleeping sites, traditional shelter, whatever, to accommodate, as I said, any person who's willing to accept a placement within 18 months. So that's the kind of overview of the legislation and what it would require. I think it's important to be clear about what the legislation is not. It is not housing for everyone, and that is, I think, going to be the basis for some of the opposition to it. The policy of San Francisco, as I've described it, is housing first, to move people to permanent solutions to their homelessness. And I supported Proposition C. I support efforts to create more permanent supportive housing for unhoused people. But I do believe that if we want to get a handle on street conditions, we are not going to be able to do that by providing housing for every unhoused person in San Francisco until Joe Biden and Congress decide that they're going to fund that exercise. I think that if we want to see significant improvement in street conditions, we're going to need to be providing more in the way of exits from the sidewalk, the plaza, the park than we are now. And this is not housing for all, and there are folks who will oppose it because of that. It's also not a solution to the political divide between San Franciscans who believe that it is never right to move someone unless you're offering them a permanent home, and those of us who believe that we can offer something that is better than the sidewalk, the park, the plaza, that may not be a permanent home, but is better, safer, and more humane. And there's just a deep divide between folks in the city who are willing, if we're meeting that threshold, to then require people to not camp in our neighborhoods and our commercial districts, and people who think that we should not enforce that unless and until we're offering housing for everyone. And so the legislation is silent on that. It would create the conditions in which the city could insist that folks leave the neighborhood, but it does not specifically say that we are going to enforce. Now, the reality that it could be used for expanded enforcement is, I think, going to be the source of additional opposition to the legislation from folks who think, as I said, we should not be sweeping anyone ever until we have permanent housing for all. And the last thing is, Rodney mentioned my work on mental health and behavioral health issues and substance abuse affecting unhoused folks since I started in this job, and I've worked on conservatorship, and I've worked to fund the street crisis response teams, and have worked to expand our access to beds for folks who need to be in a locked bed, or a bed that is a bed in a locked facility, or a less restrictive environment. These safe sleeping sites or shelters, with very few exceptions, are not going to be necessarily the right kind of therapeutic environment for someone with severe behavioral health needs. And we're going to have to find other ways to address that. This really is aimed at addressing the, I think, humanitarian imperative to have better options for people who are unhoused than we have now, and the legal requirement that if we are going to insist on having access to our public spaces for all, that we offer folks a safe, decent, humane alternative place to be. And I apologize for continuing to have to adjust my iPhone. Our internet in City Hall is down, so I'm taking this Zoom on my iPhone, which I'm not used to doing. But I think that's what I got. So happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Supervisor. And yeah, very sorry to hear about the Wi-Fi there. Living in the remote world that we are.
It's very sad.
Yeah, but it looks great on the iPhone. So we do have a few questions. And I know I typed in the chat, but those of you that are listening, please feel free to either in the chat or in the Q&A box, please feel free to drop any questions you have about this particular legislation. And I'm also sure the supervisor, if you have other questions, while we have him here. So this first question we have is, how are safe sleeping sites different from navigation centers? Are these like tent camping sites between the main library and the Asian Art Museum?
Yeah. So the safe sleeping sites that have been, the most successful safe sleeping sites that have been established during the COVID year, have been they've shared many of the attributes of navigation centers. That is low barrier, allowing folks to come in largely as they are, bringing their stuff, bringing their tent, and creating a safer and better environment than what's on the street, providing showers, providing bathrooms, providing social services, providing a space where people can be assessed for coordinated entry to determine, where they would be in prioritization for a housing unit, all that stuff. So those are the things that a safe sleeping site would share with a navigation center. The navigation centers were more traditional shelter in that they were typically in a building, or buildings were constructed. And in some cases, those buildings were very, very expensive and took many, many years to create. So one of the advantages from my perspective of the safe sleeping sites is, although they provide a similar level of services to some of the navigation centers, at least the best safe sleeping sites do, and the kind that we would want to see created under this legislation, they don't have the same kind of capital costs, and they don't need to take 2 or 3 years to open up. And again, the legislation is trying to have a place for anyone who's willing to take it. And I think in getting to that goal expeditiously, safe sleeping sites may need to be a part of that. Whether, tents, as all of the safe sleeping sites we've done so far have been, or looking at other things like, as I said, tiny homes, tough sheds, pods, all the other varieties of the interim shelter that have been explored in so many communities.
Definitely. And I guess along those lines of, these innovative ideas around housing options, we do have another question. What do you think about the idea that LA is currently exploring with converting an office building into housing for the unhoused?
Oh, I think this is a moment where we have to be creative, and whether it is looking for permanent housing solutions for folks, which I continue to believe is essential, and every community needs to do its fair share, and San Francisco in some ways has done more than our fair share. We need to be creative, and if that looks like converting buildings that have been used for other uses, either to housing or shelter, I think that's great. And if it means looking at ideas like safe sleeping sites, I think we need to be innovative, we need to be experimenting, we need to be seeing what works and doing more of that, and seeing what doesn't work and doing less of that.
Okay. Let's see, we have another question here. Where are you proposing, or does the ordinance say where you're proposing safe sleeping sites?
It doesn't say, and I think that would be an excellent place for folks who want to engage around the legislation to weigh in. I think there's a lot of things we have to factor in. One is geographic equity. It would not be fair to require one neighborhood or one part of the city to become the dumping ground for all of San Francisco's homelessness. And I think we want to be careful about that. At the same time, there are neighborhoods where honestly there just are not that many great sites. We experienced that in the Castro this past summer. The Castro continues to struggle with significant homeless issues, but during the early to middle pandemic days, the situation became beyond intolerable in Upper Market. And so I was looking for a space where we could have a safe sleeping site. And the best we could do was a school parking lot that we were able to access for 2 months. So it is not easy to find these sites, but I think taking a citywide look, or even looking at some city property that may be outside the city but close to it, we should be able to find, I hope, what I'm imagining would be 10 or 15 sites where we could do 100 to 150 placements, get them up relatively quickly. And I think there could be an advantage in having all those sites come forward together. If everybody is, having to take a little piece of share a piece of the burden, with the promise and expectation that we will actually change our engagement with unhoused people, where, currently we ask those folks implicitly to find their own place to be. And folks look for a place to be and plant themselves in a particular area and stay there until the outcry gets so great that they are moved, which is, I think, no way to run to manage homelessness, either for unhoused people or for the neighborhoods in which they're trying to find shelter.
Definitely. And David, here in this Q&A, he brings up a good point. First, he says, thank you for doing this, Supervisor. And do you believe there could be any room to incentivize communities to welcome safe sleeping sites in exchange for increased sanitization, encampment enforcement, et cetera, in the surrounding area?
I mean, I think that would be the deal that would have to be made. It's a deal that has been made around some of the navigation centers, that they are used to try and resolve encampments in the immediate area. And so that goes some to the geographic distribution. If these are actually being used to resolve encampments in a neighborhood, then, but I don't think it can be the case that, again, for a neighborhood with a concentration like the Tenderloin, for example, it may be that there isn't space in the Tenderloin for all of the folks who need to get, who we need to offer shelter to. And so I think, it's going to be a balancing of trying to give folks a place to be in the neighborhood where they are, and also the need to actually end street camping in all of our residential neighborhoods and commercial districts. I think we need to find a better way than having people camping in those neighborhoods. And I think it's reasonable to expect that we won't have street camping in those neighborhoods, but to get there, we're going to have places to offer folks that are better than the sidewalk.
Definitely. There are some creative ideas in here. How about city-owned parking garages as camping sites, like the Fifth Mission parking garage?
I think the point of this is to make HSH do the analysis, HSH in real estate, and figure out the least, the spots that are going to have the least impact on a neighborhood, commercial or residential ecosystem, where these sites will not be a detriment and can actually be a benefit. And if that's one of the floors at Fifth and Mission, I'm open to it. I think creative thinking is something we need more of, and if this passes, I hope that HSH really will take it seriously and look at sites that maybe people haven't thought of before, but could actually accommodate a reasonable number of folks. I don't think we want giant sprawling encampments anywhere. I don't think we want a 5-story garage filled with unhoused folks. That doesn't necessarily seem like a prescription for a health. I think I used the word ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem. But maybe one of the floors on there would be good. Mm-hmm. And if that came along with an end to street sheltering, in Soma, that would be maybe not the worst deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like all the creative ideas we're getting in here. And I guess with those, if we are looking at creative sites, there is a question here: how is sanitation addressed? So
it's pretty important that, for these to be successful, you have to address it. The sites that have been unsuccessful have not addressed it well. So you need to make sure there's garbage pickup. You need to make sure, as I said, that you have 24/7 staffing and adequate staffing to maintain order and safety for the people who are in the site and the surrounding neighborhood. I think you need to make sure there's access to showers, and the safe sleeping sites that I think have been most successful have provided on-site showers. I think obviously there need to be bathrooms that are getting cleaned regularly, and I think those are sort of the main kind of required elements. The safe sleeping sites have been providing food 3 meals a day, which is good. So I think you can create a safe, humane environment, even if you're doing it quickly on a lot. If you're doing it in a building, maybe there's a middle step between a lot and a fully built out navigation center that you spent $10 million on and 3 years to construct. Maybe there's something we can do, a little more quickly. But I want HSH and real estate, as I said, to be doing that thinking and coming to us with a plan to actually accommodate everybody who's willing to take a spot.
Got it, definitely. And let's see, how many tents, pods, tiny homes, tough sheds, total spots are there among the 8 sites?
Oh, it's not that many. It's, I think, in mid 200s. And they're all, at this point, they are all tents. So no, there has been no, no, I don't think anyone's done an alternative one, although I would encourage it and hope that we could do some alternative interim shelter approaches, see what works, try different things.
Yeah. And then another question along those lines, how does this, or does it tie into the Hummingbird project?
So hummingbirds could be part of meeting the overall requirement. The Hummingbird concept is a navigation center, but targeted at folks with significant behavioral health issues. And this, the first of these, well, the first and only one was opened, so far only one was opened on the SF General campus by Mayor Lee. And right now, I think it has maybe close to 30 beds there. It's not huge. And again, because it's responding to the needs of people with behavioral health issues, you want to have these hummingbirds being, even though they are shelter, not housing, on the smaller side, and able to provide additional, the resources and support that folks with behavioral health needs issues may have. So I've been working for the last year and a half at least on opening a second hummingbird, the first hummingbird in the community, that would go onto Valencia Street between 22nd and 23rd in a Salvation Army building. And because of COVID, I think our estimate is that right now the capacity of that would be 20 to 24 people. After COVID, we may be able to do more folks in there, but not many more folks. So the Hummingbird Navigation Centers are on the smaller side. I would love to see a network of hummingbirds through the city. I would love to have it so that when folks are taken to an emergency room at one of our hospitals, that they don't just get bounced out when, as soon as they're able to walk out the door, but rather get sent down the block to a hummingbird where, maybe they can take shelter and get additional support and get moved towards something better. I feel like there should be a hummingbird outside the jail so that we don't, send people from jail into homelessness and back into whatever spiral is going to happen there. So I would love to see, hummingbirds be part of the Place for All implementation, but I don't think, if part of the need for a place for all is partly about a universal pathway and off of the street. And, I don't imagine that more than, at least in the 2-year time frame that we're imagining for this legislation, if we could create 20 hummingbird or 200 hummingbird spots, that would be pretty amazing. I imagine that'll be, a portion, but not the majority of the Place for All placements.
Definitely. Yeah, a whole flock of hummingbirds, or I'm not sure. Those gaggles?
A flock of hummingbirds,
I don't know.
some safe sleeping sites, an additional navigation center or two, but get to the point where we're not where we know as San Franciscans that there is a place for anyone who's willing to accept it, that we have folks for people who are, mentally ill and may not even know they need it, but they're getting gently brought there. And also be in a position where we can say, if you're not okay with being in one of these sites, then you can't stay where you are.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we talk about San Francisco homeless, we do have a question here asking or stating there are a lot of homeless who are not from San Francisco who come in to the city. Is there any attempt at getting the homeless to return to where they came from or return to their families in San Francisco?
Yeah, I mean, we do have efforts as a city. We've been doing this for a number of years where through the Homeward Bound program, if people have a relative or family, well, I guess that's relative, but a person to connect them with who's not in San Francisco, who can help them get a new start, we will help that happen. How big of a problem this is of people being sent here, that there have been cities that have actually kind of as a matter of policy, like hospitals that would just put people on the bus to San Francisco. I'm not sure how much of that is happening today, but I think it is gaslighting to say that we are not, a portion of our homelessness challenge is not coming from somewhere else. People are migratory. There are homeless people who are from San Francisco who are now in Fresno. There are people from Fresno who are now here. I think we have to be sensitive to that, but I also think, we're going to need to manage this challenge wherever it's come from. And I think it's unreasonable to expect that we're going to be able to provide help and services to people from San Francisco and somehow ignore everybody else. And legally, we can't do that. So I also think people underestimate the extent to which, this is a statewide problem. You can drive across the bay and drive along the 80 and you will see encampments, up and down the freeway, under overpasses. We have, a major problem as a society, and we just have to figure out the best, most humane, compassionate, and yet effective way to deal with it until Joe Biden fixes it. Yeah, no, it's no small problem. That is for sure. But lots of faith in Biden, right? So we're pulling for you, Joe. Yeah. And this issue of homelessness has only really gotten a lot, maybe more visible, if not worse, during COVID. And so how has COVID and social distancing practices influenced this legislation, given, the short-term and long-term effects of COVID? Yeah, I mean, COVID was a disaster for our homelessness response in a lot of ways, in many ways. It required shelters to be thinned out, or in some cases closed, so people who had been in shelter got pushed out onto the streets. It made it harder to provide treatment to folks. Many of our residential treatment programs basically, started dramatically limiting the number of people who could come in. People might be staying longer in treatment beds, and those got clogged up. So we lost, at least in the early days, we lost a lot of the safety valves that we'd been using to get folks off the street. And we also, as a city, took on this policy of not moving tents. And by the middle of the summer, I think we had seen the impact of all of it, and it was terrible. It was particularly horrible in the Tenderloin, where, tent cities were, displacing entire sidewalks, going into the street, making it really hard for people who live in the Tenderloin to go outside and get around. But not just in the Tenderloin, certainly in my district as well, even, on the west, in neighborhoods on the west side, areas that had not had significant homeless challenges, we're seeing encampments. So we saw through COVID a whole lot of challenge around that. There was a huge influx of people in the early days for reasons that could be attributed to people's expectations they were going to get a hotel room, to apparently it was easier to get drugs here than from other places, to many things may have brought people here in the early days of the pandemic. But it did seem like our unhoused population grew, both because folks were getting pushed out of the shelter situations they were in, and we were taking on more folks from other places, we think. On the more positive side, though, I think COVID did provide an opportunity to explore this safe sleeping site notion that the city had been reluctant to explore before. And I do think that it showed that we could do humane shelter quickly, with few capital costs, that we could get things up and running and get a place for people that was better than the sidewalk. Perhaps not our ideal shelter situation for them, but something that would give them a better option than the sidewalk. And that did, help inform my thinking about, a longer term approach to trying to better manage our streets. Definitely. Let's see, I have a few questions here that are broader about homelessness, in general, but I do have one last question on this particular piece.
And maybe you can close this particular piece with a bit of a timeline for this particular piece of legislation. And then also the question is, what feedback have you gotten from your colleagues on this particular idea?
Okay, well, the two are related. So on timeline, I introduced this legislation back in October. We had the support of an organization called Rescue SF, which is a citywide organization of neighbors and neighborhoods who are pressing government, particularly City Hall, for more effective and compassionate responses to homelessness in the city. And I encourage folks, if you have not checked out Rescue SF, to do that, because I think they're a pretty good group. So we've been working some with them, with folks in the business community, small business community in particular. And I had the co-sponsorship of my friend Sandy Fewer from District 1, who had also, through the pandemic, begun, her constituents were beginning to experience a homelessness problem that was, more significant than certainly what they've been seeing before. So that was October, and we started talking with colleagues and also meeting with neighborhood groups and trying to build support for this, meeting with the Coalition on Homelessness and homeless advocates. And you will note that it is now March. So normally with legislation, after you introduce it, you try to get it in front of the committee, and then you try to get it passed out of the committee with positive recommendation, and then you try to get it to the Board of Supervisors and get 6 votes or 8 votes if you need to overcome a mayoral veto, and then get it in front of the mayor. At this point, Supervisor Fewer is no longer on the board. None of my colleagues have committed to supporting this legislation. Although, none of them have firmly said they're opposing it either. The feedback that we have gotten, the criticisms and concerns have come from different quarters. I think for the Coalition on Homelessness and homeless advocates, the concerns about this legislation are twofold, and those twofolds are related. So although the coalition is supportive of safe sleeping sites and of the expansion of safe sleeping sites, in fact, homeless folks themselves in surveys, many have indicated, I think a majority may have indicated, that they would prefer safe sleep sites to congregate shelter. So advocates are interested in seeing an expansion in safe sleeping sites. What gives the coalition heartburn about this legislation is that it is moving towards something like shelter for all. And the concern about shelter for all is that it is not housing for all, and that if you start putting more resources into exits from the street to something that is not shelter or that is not housing, you are going to inevitably be taking resources away from housing. So I think the coalition would support a modest expansion in safe sleeping sites, but they don't want a commitment to sheltering anybody who's willing to accept shelter from the street. And that is related to their second concern, which is they will not support this legislation if these additional sites that are created become the basis for enforcement of laws that prohibit things like camping in neighborhoods, that kind of thing. So they've asked to have the legislation scaled back to be, I've called it a place for some, some expansion of safe sleeping sites, and to explicitly say that it will not be used for enforcement. And I've been unwilling to do either of those things, which I think means that the coalition will probably have to oppose the legislation, which means that it will be harder for my colleagues to support it. In other quarters, I think there are folks who don't understand why San Francisco can't just enforce the damn law, crack down on the drug dealing, and restore order on our streets. And I think are concerned that any additional expansion of services to unhoused people is just going to bring more people to San Francisco. I understand that perspective. I think there are some valid points in there around, I do think we have to think every policy that we enact. I think we need to be somewhat sensitive to, like, what is this doing to our is this in fact bringing people to San Francisco? I don't honestly believe that safe sleeping sites, although I think preferable to camping on the sidewalk, are going to be a regional draw for people to come to San Francisco. And in fact, if they are paired with enforcement and do result in kind of taking down these communities that, are largely about, or some of which are largely about drugs, I think that putting some guardrails into the system may make San Francisco a less desirable place for some people who might come here. So I think, I understand the fear and concern of people who think this is going to make San Francisco somehow a draw for unhoused people seeking a spot in a safe sleeping site. I tend to doubt that. And the other thing is, as a legal, political, practical, and I think ethical matter, we are not going to address camping in neighborhoods unless we have places to offer people. It's just not going to happen. So if we want to get to that world, which I think is where most San Franciscans want to get to, which is no one's camping on the streets, but nobody has to camp on the streets, I think we need to do something like a place for all. So we're continuing to have these conversations with colleagues, hoping to get it in front of a committee at the board in March. I'm hoping that it will not die at that committee. I'm hoping that we will have enough support, and people will be hearing, supervisors will be hearing from their constituents and from the business community, particularly the small business community, and that we will move forward with this without, those concessions that I think we really can't make. I think it does need to be a place for all, not a place for some. And I think although I have not said we're going to use this to enforce, I also really do not want this legislation to get weighted down with a prohibition on enforcement. So if we can get that to the full Board of Supervisors, then we could get it voted on probably as early as April or May. And then, of course, there's a 2-year implementation period. And there is that, decision that has to get made after the implementation plan about whether we're actually going to make the appropriation to move forward with the vision. But the legislation itself could get adopted April, May. If it dies, I believe in this, and I would look at whether there might be support to do this as a ballot measure. I think if it is a ballot measure, people are actually going to insist on enforcement being included in it, because I think there is a desire to see our public spaces being restored to being something everybody can use. And we'll look at that for 2022.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. That was a great overview. And I know we have several small businesses here in my chat that have some broader questions about homelessness that, this legislation will maybe tackle some of it, but it's a very complex problem, as we all know. And I guess I'll start here. You had mentioned a few times, we all know the unfortunate, the drug issues our city faces, but as the supervisor spearheaded the methamphetamine task force, what lessons can be learned as the city sets up a fentanyl program?
Oh, my goodness. Well, one lesson is that there is a long distance between envisioning a program and announcing policy. There's something like the meth task force, and then the articulation of a program like the meth sobering centers that came out of the meth task force, and the actual implementation of that vision. So the meth task force, which I co-chaired, was a 2019 project. It was one of the first things I took on as a member of the Board of Supervisors. It was a great process and engaged a lot of good folks and came to consensus around a lot of measures. And the top 2 recommendations were the meth sobering center and a way for people to summon a street crisis response that wasn't the police. We've begun to roll out the street crisis response teams, and we have in the budget a meth sobering center. But it is frustrating to me how long it takes to get things done. And maybe that's just part of our reality. I'm hoping that with a new director of behavioral health services, that we'll be able to move more quickly on addressing things like the meth crisis, the fentanyl crisis. We certainly, Tom Wolf, I think it's Tom Wolf, although he may be quoting someone else, has said that in San Francisco it is it's far too easy to get high and far too hard to find treatment or to get into treatment. And I think that's absolutely correct. We know we have a mandate for treatment on demand. We regularly, the Department of Public Health prepares reports that basically say that we're meeting the demand for treatment. We do a terrible job of building the demand, and we know, I mean, it's just not true that we're getting treatment to all the folks who would accept it in, say, that our criminal justice system or other places. So we need to do a much better job of getting treatment to folks. So there's a lot of work to do, and I think it needs priority, and it needs effective people leading that effort, which again is why it's so important that we have a new director of behavioral health services, and why I'm hoping she is truly excellent, because that's what we need.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a crisis. That's all you could call it. Let's see. We only have a couple minutes left, and I have some very broad questions here.
Oh, wow.
With, this one might be more of a question for our city economist, but how do you happen to know how much the city spends annually per capita, including all direct and indirect costs? And overall, the sentiment, should citizens feel good about their per capita expense on homelessness?
Well, we spend a great deal. We spent a great deal before Prop C passed. There was a figure that, and if my computer were working, I could easily probably pull up some of these numbers. We were spending about, I think, $300 million a year on the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing when I started. So again, pre-Prop C. We were spending most of that money on housing formerly unhoused people in permanent supportive housing. And I think people lose sight of the successes that our homelessness investments have had. So if you are a San Francisco taxpayer, you can be proud that that your dollars have actually moved a lot of people off of the streets into permanent supportive housing. If you're a San Francisco taxpayer, though, I think you are also entitled to be enormously frustrated that those significant local dollars that you have made available have not had a greater impact on the street. And I think it's possible to be spending a lot of money on a really good thing, which is more permanent supportive housing for homeless people. But because the need is practically infinite, at least for the purposes of a local jurisdiction like San Francisco, you can spend money on that project of housing unhoused people all day long and have no impact or very little impact on the problem on the streets. And that's part of the motivation for me in introducing A Place for All, is to get us a little more focused, not all of our focus, but some more of our focus onto getting folks who are on the street off the street.
Yes, definitely. A lot of our problems are so visible, and to many of our small businesses, these issues around drug use and homelessness are, as you know, very they can be devastating factors.
Yeah. And I think it's, sometimes those issues get sort of lumped under the category of quality of life, which I think does not do justice to the extent of the disruption that is caused for a small business owner in the Castro who has a severely, a different seriously sick individual coming into her shop multiple times every day. Mm-hmm. It's untenable. And I know there are still, because I represent the district I do, I assume that all neighborhoods in San Francisco are experiencing this. I know not all neighborhoods in San Francisco are experiencing this, but a lot of neighborhoods, too many neighborhoods, are just feeling the weight of these very sick people who we are not responding to, who we are not getting care to, and who we are just leaving out there to cause problems for themselves, and certainly for the small businesses that are trying to make it in a really difficult time. And I don't think that A Place for All will solve all those problems, but I do think it moves in the direction of establishing some rules, the way we want things to be, where we want telling folks where we want them to be, and creates the conditions where folks who can't work within our framework have to look at another option, because they're not going to be able to continue to be on the sidewalk outside the candy store.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I know Rodney needs to close us out, but if you have any last words, we do have questions around housing and vacancies. A lot of our small businesses, as you've noted, are very concerned about, post-COVID, the myriad of issues that we're facing as a city. They all kind of are related in some way or another. But if you have any closing words before we end.
Well, we got a lot of problems and challenges to work on coming out of COVID. I do think the homelessness, mental health, behavioral health piece is a significant one. It is the one I hear about most from small businesses in the neighborhoods certainly in the Castro and Upper Market. I think there are other, vacancies sometimes related to that issue, but there's a host of other issues as well. And I think there's a lot for us all to work together on coming out of this. If folks do want to be supportive of the Place for All legislation, I encourage you to get in touch with my office. My legislative aide, Erin Mundy, is my point person on it, and her email is erin.mundy@sfgov.org, and that's ERIN.MUNDY@sfgov.org. And please, shoot her an email. I encourage folks to sign up for Rescue SF, who will keep you posted and abreast of good things that are good and bad things that are going on around homelessness in San Francisco, and give you an opportunity to weigh in around budget time and around legislation like A Place for All.
Okay, Supervisor, I want to thank you very much for enlightening us today. I think, from the Chamber's perspective, I know you agree, we're never going to fully recover unless we address our quality of life, and that is for those that are on the streets, as well as those who do business and live here and feel safe. And you touched on the small business, and we can all imagine that shopkeeper who doesn't have the money for a security company to come and protect him or her, and they're alone in that shop, and it is horrifying. I've been in that situation, and it's just a very scary situation. So thank you for what you are doing. I think any legislation, we are able to always pick it apart, find what's wrong with it. I ask you not to stop, though, and to keep focusing on this issue. As in your bio, you have committed yourself to a lot of these similar problems. So please don't stop in giving up. Some great ideas today. Maybe the office building is not a bad one. Taking a look and converting some to dormitory style living. Maybe in the same way that a senior campus, a senior center is able to by floor have different treatments and services depending on the need, and you can consolidate and have accountability for some of the services offered there. The garage is an interesting one, and maybe that's an opportunity too. But again, I want to thank you all and invite everyone to reach out to the supervisor who's interested in finding out more about safe sleeping sites and A Place for All. Thank you, Erin, very much for setting this up with us today. And want to just make a couple of announcements about the Chamber of Commerce going forward. As you guys all know, the Chamber of Commerce is a nonprofit group. We are funded by you and supported by you, members, just like KQED. So your continued support is every dollar counts. It's so important right now as we start to gain momentum for recovery. There's some other events coming up on the calendar. On the last page here, you see March 2nd, Public Policy Forum, talking about high-speed rail that could create a lot of jobs and move people in and out of San Francisco and relieve some of the traffic. On March 4th, small business focus on San Francisco Chamber Focus. We have the Bayshop event coming up on March 4th as well, and a chamber mixer, the best we can do to network and get to know each other a little bit better. Thank you to Supervisor Mandelman for speaking today. Want to thank our sponsors, Safeway, BlackRock, Kaiser, Delta Dental, and our title sponsor, Waymo. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next month.